My panel, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer, a retired Marine Corps intelligence officer and the president of Strategic Risk Management Service, KIP. And Kamran Bokhari is the director of strategy and programs with the Center for Global Policy. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. And Kamran, I'd like to start with you. The president warning against a slaughter and warning the Russians and Syrians that the U.S. and the world are watching. Do you see the Russians and Syrians heeding these warnings?
I think they'll definitely pay attention to what the White House is saying, and specifically President Trump. But then the question is, beyond the statements from the president and Secretary Pompeo and others, what is it that the United States will actually do beyond the symbolic airstrikes that we saw the last time around when we had, the reported use of chemical weapons? So, I mean, it's one thing to say that we're watching, but it's another thing to back it up with some form of deterrent. And I just don't see that.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel Hell, the president has been skeptical of U.S. intervention and things, but he has followed through with action. When he saw the images of civilians being killed in previous Syrian assaults, he did order strikes in 2017 and in 2018 after the use of chemical weapons. What kind of intervention do you see from the U.S.?
Well, Michelle, what I would see would be rocket strikes, shooting missiles, and possibly airstrikes. We've done that before. We did have some standoff on how we did that, but I would see basically naval air and Air Force air power being brought to bear if we're going to do something like that. And what we look at is taking out their indirect fires capabilities, taking out their ability to deliver airstrikes and taking out their ability to fire artillery and rockets into Idlib. The issue there is the Russians are heavily engaged with firing into Idlib. They are using their warplanes to drop bombs. So the question is, what do we target? And it could open up into a much larger engagement.
So, Hal, what would trigger U.S. intervention?
Well, I think if we saw mass casualties, obviously if we saw the use of chemical weapons, even though we didn't use the term red line, that is pretty much we've laid that out as a red line, not just for us, but for the international community as well. That would probably trigger a response. But also, one of the things we might see is if there's a mass exodus, particularly going toward the Turkish border, you might see the Turks and the U.S. kind of coming together on this and working more closely than we have been. It's been kind of a strained relationship of late, but by necessity, it might come together rather quickly.
Well, Kamran, to Hal's point, Turkey does share a border with the region. It's already hosting over 3.5 million Syrian refugees. So how do you see Turkey responding to this?
I think, Turkey is already militarily involved to the extent that it can, considering its circumstances on the home front with the political stability and the economic upheaval that's going on, and the cash crisis, especially with the Turkish lira tumbling. And so, there's not a whole lot of bandwidth for the Turks. But what they do want to see is through that negotiated, understanding with the Russians and the Iranians that there will be some form of accommodation. I suspect that Tehran, Moscow, and Ankara may come to an agreement to say, okay, we will, not engage, we being the Iranians and the Russians along with the Syrian army, in such a way that pushes a very large number of people into the border, areas with Turkey and then across the border. But at the same time, the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrians are going to demand something in return, which is that we need to be able to take this town from certain groups or this area. So we need to see where does the compromise, where do they compromise on? What's that line? And it's not an easy negotiation.
Right. Hal, is there a diplomatic way out of this? There are about 70,000 estimated rebels, as Syria calls them, on the ground. Do you see them surrendering?
Well, it's a hodgepodge of a lot of different groups. It's not just one homogenous force. So you'd have to have broad agreement in a number of areas with a number of different groups, with a number of different leaders who would agree to lay down their arms. And this is kind of their last stand for a number of them, particularly ones that are former or current al-Qaeda affiliates. They might feel that fighting to the death is the best cause of action. And in that regard, they could, by their defensive posture, trigger the very thing that we're trying to negotiate away from happening. Frankly, Russian military doctrine, Syrian military doctrine is such that what everyone's afraid is you're looking at this province and seeing a large-scale Aleppo-type situation. Right. And that's what everybody's afraid of, especially the Turks.
Right. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer, appreciate your analysis as always. Kamran Bokhari, thank you. Thank you both for your time. All right. Coming up on Clear Cut.